I was born and raised in Sheboygan, Wisconsin. Unless you live nearby, you probably never heard of it. Even people in the large Wisconsin cities, Madison, Milwaukee, don't know we exist. Wisconsin is generally known for our cheese, our cows, and our love of beer. And of course, for our excess of mental institutions and serial killers. Ed Gein and Jeffrey Dahmer hail from my home state. In case you've been living under a rock, they are two of the most infamous serial killers in America. I don't know if it's the cold climate or what, but we seem to breed quite a bit of crazy up here. Sheboygan is not immune from the crazy. We have this old abandoned asylum by the highway. It used to house the criminally insane, at least according to local folklore. This is where the Milk-White legend came from. Milk-White was supposedly a patient at the asylum. He was born there, his mother being one of the inmates. No one knew what to do with him, so he just crawled around the asylum, eating scraps. He had no other kids to play with. He was an albino, and any form of light horribly burned his skin. So, he was never awake when there was daylight. Milk-White grew up learning madness from the other inmates, desperate for human companionship. Something about that madness turned him from a human into a demon. The story is that one day he found a way to get out of the asylum. He got it into his head that he could go find friends from the city. He peered into the windows of every house to see if anyone was awake. If he found a child awake, he would steal them away. Of course, children are loud, so instead of taking them alive, he would use his huge teeth to crush their necks. He would prop them up in the basement of the asylum, pretending to have an entire room of friends. He would sing them nursery rhymes in the dead of night. The asylum was shut down a long time ago. Milk-White had nowhere to go, so they say he still lives in the abandoned building, going out at night and bringing back bodies of any kid still awake after dark. This was all regarded as an urban legend, but I remember the story from back when I was a kid. There was an odd little rhyme that we used to sing about it. It went, "Hush now, sleep tight, or else beware of Milk-White. He doesn't fuss, he doesn't fight, he'll kill you dead with just one bite." Parents would use the tale to scare children into going to sleep. It worked well, or at least it did for me. I fully believed the myth up until middle school. I remember that's when a new kid moved to town. He was from New York City, so we all thought he was way cooler than any of us. His name was Jimmy. He had a New York accent and everything. He wore chucks and had a leather jacket. He wore it all year round, even in the middle of winter. He was never quiet about how much he hated Sheboygan. My friend, Hans, and I made an uneasy friendship with him. Hans was 17, but dumb enough to get held back to middle school. He was huge compared to us. We'd been friends for a while. I actually grew up with his brother, Peter. Peter disappeared on a camping trip when we were 7. After that, I started becoming closer with Hans. We'd hang out, play video games, and just do nothing. He wasn't very smart, hence being held back for so long. But he was a good guy. I liked being his friend. I was a pretty typical 12-year-old, scrawny, trying to appear cooler than I was. I wasn't particularly special, but I guess I was a good kid. Jimmy was one of the all-confidence kids. He could talk to girls and get himself out of trouble easily. He also thought he knew everything. It was Jimmy's idea to scope out the asylum. I think he was bored of the snow and wanted something exciting. That's when I told him about Milk-White. "What a crock of shit," he responded. "That's a fucking baby story. You don't really believe that." I looked at Hans, who shook his head stupidly. Hans was pretty happy to have friends, so he would have done anything for Jimmy or me. I was scared, but I shook my head too. Jimmy decided we would go to the asylum at night. He joked about Milk-White, calling him a pathetic excuse for a ghost story. Hans and I were horrified that he would mock the creature that haunted our childhoods, but we tried to act calm about it. We snuck out around midnight and met up at the overpass. I was bundled in about 7 layers of wool. Jimmy, like always, just wore his leather jacket. He led the way as he trudged through the snow towards the abandoned building. It must have been impressive once, but now it just looked decayed. While we were walking, Hans grabbed my arm and pointed to the ground. A set of footprints in the snow. The prints were large, like that of a grown man, but there were toe marks, as if the person was barefoot. I debated showing them to Jimmy, but I knew he would just laugh at me. I shrugged at Hans. Come on. We got to the main entrance of the asylum, just as a fresh falling of snow began to accumulate. Jimmy tried to open the door, but it was shut firmly. He kicked at it, but no use. Hans was shivering. Looks like we can't get in. Jimmy laughed at him. You fucking pussy. We haven't even tried yet. Jimmy had a terrible mouth. Hans and I were good Midwestern boys. We never swore, but Jimmy was very different than us. He moved around to a boarded up window. It was low enough that he could use his hands to pry under the boards. With a violent jerk, he pulled a plank away. We could see that there was no glass inside. Jimmy made a loud "aha" sound and fought the other boards loose. Coming, pansies? He pulled himself up to the window and slipped inside. Hans and I looked at each other, nervously. If we went in, we'd be confronting the very thing that we had feared since kindergarten. If we didn't, we'd lose our friendship with Jimmy and probably any shred of reputation. I took a deep breath of cold air and hoisted myself through the window. I landed on a pile of broken boards. Apparently, other people had tried to get in as well, because there were planks everywhere. Jimmy was rubbing his leg. I think I fucking cut myself. His jeans had a long gash in them. I stood up and dusted myself off. Hans flew through the window with a heavy thump. He shrieked as he held up a nail embedded in his palm. Jimmy went over to him and yanked the thing out. Tears poured down Hans's cheeks. Jimmy rolled his eyes. You're a fucking baby, aren't you? Scared of a ghost and a little blood? He turned his back on us and started walking towards the hall. We had all thought ahead to bring flashlights, but they weren't going to be much help. The halls were pitch black. We had walked along the wall, keeping one hand steady to balance. We heard a squeak from behind us, and I almost jumped out of my skin. Jimmy just laughed. Scared of mice now too, queer? The entire time, we explored the asylum. I barely breathed. It wasn't just the darkness. It was the unknown. We found an empty wheelchair and a creepy-looking metal cots. Our flashlights scanned the blackness, but nothing moved. Once we had been exploring for an hour or so, I felt my heart beat slow. Jimmy was obviously right. Milk White was just a baby story to scare kids. It was Hans who found the door to the basement. He pointed at it with his flashlight. Jimmy tried to handle it, but it was stuck. He tried kicking it down, but he just hurt his ankle. I stood silently. Jimmy shone his light onto Hans's face. You, big guy, kick the door. I want to see what's down there. Hans started trembling and shook his head no. Jimmy pushed him. Come on, you big idiot. Do something useful for fuck's sake. Hans looked down, embarrassed. I stood towards them. Maybe we should go. Jimmy sneered. Or maybe you should. We all stopped because of what we heard. It was footsteps. It sounded like they were coming up the stairs from the basement door. I stared, open-mouthed at Jimmy, who was frozen in place. The footsteps were loud. They sounded like skin slapping on metal. Turn off your lights now, Jimmy hissed. We all shut our flashlights off and huddled against the wall. Hans was shaking really bad, and I could smell that he had peed on himself. Jimmy was swearing under his breath. The footsteps kept going until they were almost right next to us. Then, there was a sound of a doorknob creaking. It was completely dark, so we couldn't see anything. All we could do was listen to the door slide open. That's when we heard the voice. It was the deep voice of a man, but sung unreasonably high. It sang/whispered, "Hush now, sleep tight." Jimmy was rocking back and forth. I could feel the fear emanating from him. He had his jaw clenched and his teeth made a horrible crunch. The voice kept singing, "Beware, beware of milk white." I must have trembled because my thumb knocked on the button of my flashlight. A single second, it illuminated the hallway, and we could see the source of the voice. All of us gasped at once. It stood barely 2 feet away. It might have been a man once, but now it had the posture of a scorpion. It was naked, standing with its feet spread apart, like an insect. Its head reared back, like it was about to spit venom. The nails on its feet and hands were so overgrown, they curled back into the skin. The teeth jutted from its mouth. They hung down as if it were too heavy for it to lift its head properly. Its skin, it wasn't white, not like the rhyme said. It was stained red. It took a step towards us and whispered, "Kill you dead with just one bite." And that's when Hans bashed my head with his flashlight. I woke up on the floor of the asylum. Daylight had only just creeped into the sky. My head was pounding. I struggled to stand, but I must have gotten frostbite in the night. My fingers and toes were completely numb. I looked around and saw Jimmy passed out near me. He had a giant bruise on his temple. I tried to wake him, but he wouldn't stir. I don't know how I did it, but I managed to stand up and drag Jimmy out of the window. I wasn't strong enough to sling him over my shoulder, so I just dragged his body through the snow. He made a soft pain sound, but didn't wake up. I made it to the tavern by the highway. They weren't open, but I pounded on the door until my knuckles bled, screaming for help. The owner finally came to see what the noise was and let us in. He was visibly shaken by our appearance. He called the police and our parents. Soon I was wrapped in blankets and slowly beginning to feel warm again. Jimmy eventually woke up in the hospital with minor memory loss. I told the police the story, and they searched the entire asylum. They didn't find anything. No evidence of foul play, except the blood Jimmy had lost. No one knew where Hans was. His parents were devastated. Now they had lost 2 sons. Jimmy had no memory of the night's events. At least, that's what he said. My parents made me see a psychiatrist who told me I created the whole thing in my mind. She said Hans must have done something terrible to Jimmy and I just blocked it out. After all, Hans was so much older and bigger than us. And then he left town so suddenly. The psych implied it was sexual abuse. She said I made up the image of Milkwhite because I knew it from my childhood. It was easier than facing the truth. I went to bed before dark every night until I went away for college. I never went back to Sheboygan. My parents hounded me to visit, but I refused to return. I think it's because of what Hans did to me. But I know what I saw. And I know that Hans only hurt me to knock me out. He knew that Milkwhite can't get you if you're asleep.